Four names moved in the autumn of 1477: Artois, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the Free County of Burgundy. Each one had its own courts, its own tolls, and its own long quarrels with the neighbors. All four passed into the keeping of a family that had not taken an acre of them by force. One name did not move: the Duchy of Burgundy itself, the land the inheritance was named for, was taken by France and kept. So the transfer arrived with a hole in the middle of it. The family gained the revenue, and it did not gain the place that the revenue had been named after. The instrument was a wedding. On the 19th of August 1477, Maximilian of Austria married Mary of Burgundy, and a belt of provinces along the North Sea and the Rhine changed hands. No wall was breached, and no town was starved, and a contract did in a single afternoon what armies along that frontier had been failing to do for years. That is the shape of the thing. Not conquest, but contract. And the question worth carrying all the way to the end is simple enough to state now. What does a family finally pay for building itself out of marriages instead of wars? And who ends up paying it? If long histories of power and its price belong in the evening queue, subscribe to Dynasty and Dust. It is easy to say that the Burgundian inheritance passed to the Habsburgs, and the sentence is repeated everywhere. It is also missing the interesting part. What passed was a group of northern provinces holding the cloth towns of the Low Countries and the shipping that carried their output. On a map, they looked like a fragment. In an account book, they were among the richest ground in Europe. The two sides of the match were not equal in what they carried. Maximilian was the son of a reigning emperor and brought a name, an army, and very little land of his own. Mary brought the land. That asymmetry is the whole mechanism, and it will appear again. What she brought him was not a country. It was an assembly of duchies, counties, and free cities joined by descent rather than by any single constitution, and none of them had agreed to be one thing. After the transfer, they kept what they had: their own courts, their own tolls, their own weights, and their own reasons to refuse. So the first acquisition was already a partial one, and already a complicated one. A house that would spend 2 centuries collecting crowns began by failing to hold the one place it was supposed to have come from. Something was gained, something was left behind. That pattern repeats often enough in what follows that it is worth marking the first time it appears. There is a line in Latin that has followed the family ever since. Let others wage wars, it says. Fortunate Austria, marry instead. It is a hexameter, it is memorable, and it is attached in the surviving material to Maximilian and his marriages. The line does not come with an author, a date, or any sign that Maximilian said it. No instruction survives from him setting out such a policy. It reads like a plan, and it works like a slogan, and it arrived, as slogans about long strategies usually do, only after there was a strategy to describe. That ordering matters more than it looks. A man arranging one marriage in 1477 was solving one problem in 1477. He wanted a rich inheritance, and the woman holding it needed a husband with soldiers behind him. Neither of them was executing a 200-year plan. Patterns of that length are visible only from the far end. Somebody looking back across the whole run can see the marriages lining up like stitches in a seam, and can give the seam a name, and can put the name in Latin so that it sounds deliberate. The people making the stitches were watching their hands. Still, the phrase stuck. And it stuck because it was accurate about the outcome. It became the standard summary of how this family worked, repeated for centuries by people describing what had already happened. A seam that real is worth following. One wedding moved provinces that armies could not move. That worked, and things that work get done again. But a seam is only as strong as the thread running through it. And the thread in this case was one woman's life, which is a thin thing to hang 4 provinces on. The family had acquired an inheritance by contract. It had not acquired any means of keeping that inheritance if the person who carried the claim stopped carrying it. 5 years after the wedding, Mary of Burgundy rode out with a hunting party near Wijnendale and did not come back. The birds were out, her horse threw her, and then fell on top of her, and she died of internal injuries on the 27th of March, 1482. She was 25 years old. The settlement had taken a wedding and a treaty to arrange. In the person who actually held it, it had lasted 5 years. Everything that follows, across the next 2 centuries, proceeds from an inheritance that had already shown how quickly it could be interrupted. She was pregnant when she fell. The record notes the fact and stops there. What it does not record is any provision for this. There was no arrangement in place for the death of the person the entire settlement depended on, because the settlement was 5 years old, and she was 25, and nobody plans for that. What happened next exposed exactly what the marriage had achieved and what it had not. The titles did not pass to the husband. They passed to the son. Philip was 3 years old and had no memory of his mother. Maximilian found himself governing as regent for a small child, rather than ruling anything in his own right. This is the part that is usually skipped. He had married the inheritance and had not become it. To the towns and assemblies of those provinces, he was a foreign soldier holding a temporary office on behalf of a boy. Several of them told him so, at length and in writing. A regent governs on sufferance. He can be obeyed for years and still be told, in the same breath, that the obedience is a favor rather than a duty. Maximilian spent the next decade discovering how far that gap could be pushed by men who held charters older than his marriage. France moved on that weakness before the year was out. On the 23rd of December 1482, the Treaty of Arras took the free county of Burgundy and Artois out of the settlement and handed them to the French crown. Maximilian signed. The alternative was a war he could not fund. 2 of the 4 names from the opening list were gone inside 5 years of being acquired. The same instrument that had moved provinces without a siege had been used, by somebody else, to move 2 of them straight back. There is a particular kind of loss in that. An army can be beaten and the ground fought over again. A signature closes the matter in an afternoon and leaves nothing to fight about, only a document to resent. Artois had been Burgundian, then Habsburg, then French, inside a single decade. The people living on it were not consulted at any point in that sequence, and their tolls, courts, and obligations changed each time the name at the top of the page did. So the method cut in both directions from the very start. What a document could assemble, another document could take apart, and the second document did not need an army behind it any more than the first one had. That is not a flaw anybody chose to dwell on at the time. It was followed almost immediately by a gain so large that the losses stopped being interesting to anyone except the people living in Artois. It is worth being exact about what was actually being assembled, because the word empire does the wrong work here and does it early. There was no common language across these territories. There was no common law, no common coinage, and no common treasury. There was no single assembly that could vote a tax across the whole of it. Money had to be requested piece by piece, from bodies that each had their own reasons to refuse. A ruler in that position does not command. He negotiates in 15 places at once, with 15 different sets of precedents in front of him. And he does it while borrowing, because negotiation takes time, and armies do not wait. Debt is the shadow of this whole arrangement. It appears at the very start, it grows with every acquisition, and it never once leaves the story. What held the pieces together was one family, a set of documents saying that the family held them, and the continued willingness of local men to act as though those documents meant something. That last condition is the load-bearing one, and it is the one nobody could enforce. It had to be renewed, in practice, every year, in every town, by people who were free to reconsider. Each piece went on running itself very much as it had before. A town that had bought a privilege from a Burgundian duke expected to keep it under a Habsburg one. It generally did keep it. The alternative was a quarrel the new owner could not afford. Assemblies met. They granted money and they withheld money. Charters were produced, read aloud, and pointed at. Old ink was a weapon in those rooms, and everyone present understood that the older the ink, the harder it was to argue with. This is the environment the family had married into. Not a throne with a country attached, but a filing cabinet with an army standing next to it, and a standing obligation to keep proving that the contents of the cabinet still applied. The new owner inherited the revenues and the arguments in the same transaction, and the arguments turned out to be attached to the land far more firmly than the revenues were. A duke could be replaced. A charter could not, or at least not cheaply, and the cost of trying was usually higher than the sum in dispute, which raises a problem that will run under everything that follows. A family holding property on those terms needs more marriages rather than fewer. Every fresh document is another rope on the same tent. A tent held by one rope has already been shown to collapse. So the family went looking, and it went looking in the one direction where something genuinely new had just become available. 2 Iberian kingdoms had been joined by a marriage of their own. They had just taken Granada, they had just sent ships west, and they were, for the first time in centuries, a single block that could be married rather than a set of quarreling neighbors. So the ropes went south. In 1496, the family that had just acquired the Low Countries went looking for a second inheritance, and found one in a place that had only just become a place at all. On the 20th of October 1496, in a church at Lier near Antwerp, Joanna of Castile married Philip of Austria. She was the second daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their own marriage had joined the Spanish kingdoms a generation earlier, and their soldiers had taken Granada 4 years before this wedding. He was the boy who had inherited the Burgundian provinces at 3 years old and was now a grown man with a court of his own. 2 inheritances that had been assembled by marriage were introduced to each other by marriage, which by this point was simply how these families conducted business. Neither side was doing anything unusual. Every ruling house in Europe married for advantage, and most of them married relatives to do it. What separates this particular wedding from the others around it is not the method. It is what the method later produced, and nobody in that church could see any of it. The wedding was one half of a matched pair, and the other half is the one that mattered. In the same arrangement, Philip's sister Margaret married Joanna's brother John, the heir to Castile and Aragon. 2 children of the northern house married 2 children of the southern house, in opposite directions, inside a single negotiated agreement. It was not a rope. It was a knot, tied twice, and the point of tying it twice was that a knot survives the failure of any one strand. That is sound reasoning. It is also, as the next 3 years demonstrated, reasoning that assumes the strands fail one at a time. The purpose of all this was not the union of Spain with the Habsburg lands, and it is important to be clear that nobody at the table was aiming at that. The purpose was France. Both houses had lost territory to the French crown inside living memory, one at Arras and one in Italy. Both wanted the other standing on the same side of the next quarrel. Within that plan, John was the important marriage, because John was the heir who would one day rule Spain. Joanna was the spare daughter, married off in the direction where a spare daughter could do the most good. It is worth holding on to that ranking, because everything that follows inverts it. The marriage the negotiators cared about produced nothing at all. The marriage they treated as secondary produced the largest inheritance in Europe. And then the arithmetic of the 15th century did to this family what it did to every family, rich or poor, in that period. It did it 3 times in 3 years. Each time, it took the person standing directly in front of the inheritance, and each time, the space behind that person shuffled forward 1 place. John, Prince of Asturias, died at Salamanca on the 4th of October, 1497. He was 19 years old, and he had been married for less than a year. The record supplies the date and the place. It does not supply a cause that can be relied on. What can be said is the consequence. The heir to Castile and Aragon was removed from the succession. Margaret was a widow before she had finished being a bride. The careful double knot tied the previous autumn had lost one of its 2 strands inside 12 months. The claim moved sideways to the eldest sister, Isabella, who had married Manuel of Portugal, and who now stood first in line for everything her parents held. She held that position for a matter of months. She died in 1498, within an hour of giving birth, which was a common enough end in that century to need no explanation and no embellishment. The crown moved again before the court had finished adjusting to where it had been standing the week before. Twice in 14 months, the future of 2 kingdoms had been reassigned by an event in a bedroom that no treaty could reach and no negotiation could anticipate. It moved to a baby. Miguel was born on the 23rd of August, 1498. The courts of Portugal, of Castile, and of Aragon swore to him in turn. That made an infant in a cradle the future ruler of the whole Iberian Peninsula and of everything its ships had begun to reach. 3 separate sets of grown men traveled to look at him and swear oaths to him. He died on the 19th of July, 1500, aged 1 year and 11 months, and all 3 of those oaths became waste paper on the same afternoon. The record gives the date. It does not give a reason, and infant death in that century so rarely came with a reason that the absence is not even remarkable. What is remarkable is what the absence moved. A child of 1 year and 11 months had stood between the Habsburg family and the Spanish inheritance. When he was gone, there was nobody left standing there at all. 3 deaths: a brother at 19, a sister in childbirth, an infant nephew before his 2nd birthday. Not one of them arranged. Not one of them foreseen by anybody who had sat at the negotiating table in 1496. And between them, they emptied the entire space in front of the spare daughter who had been sent north to marry the boy from the Low Countries. Joanna was 4th in line on the day she was married. By the summer of 1500 she was 1st. Nobody had planned that. Nobody could have planned it. The marriage that ended up delivering Spain into Habsburg hands had been contracted for an entirely different purpose, by people who considered it the less important half of the deal. The strategy that would later be summarized in a single line of Latin had, at the single most consequential moment in its whole history, almost nothing to do with strategy. It had to do with a fever, a childbirth, and an infant who did not reach 2. This matters for a reason that goes beyond tidiness about causes. If the greatest single acquisition in the family's history arrived by accident, then the pattern the family later followed so deliberately was learned from an outcome it had not produced. That is a dangerous kind of lesson. It teaches confidence in a method that, on the decisive occasion, did not actually do the work. The weddings were real. The knots were tied carefully and by competent people. But the thing that delivered Spain was the removal of 3 lives, and no negotiator can arrange that or take credit for it. Which brings all of it down to 1 child, born at Ghent in the year 1500, in the same season that the baby in Granada died. He would live to collect what 4 grandparents had each spent a lifetime holding, and he would collect it in 3 separate installments before he was old enough to be trusted with any of it. Charles inherited Spain in 1516. He took the crown of Castile and the crown of Aragon as co-monarch with his mother. She had been set aside from government and would remain set aside for the rest of a very long life. He arrived in the country as a stranger. He did not speak Castilian. He brought Flemish advisors with him, and he was there to rule 2 kingdoms that had been entirely separate until his grandparents married each other. The cities of Castile rose against him within 4 years of his arrival, which is the ordinary price of inheriting a place rather than knowing it. He put the rising down. But the shape of the problem never changed, for as long as he held the inheritance, because the inheritance was not a country and could not be persuaded to behave as one. 3 years after that, his other grandfather died. Maximilian, the man who had ridden out to marry Mary of Burgundy 42 years earlier, left the Austrian hereditary lands to the same grandson. So the northern inheritance and the southern inheritance, which had been joined by 2 marriages across 2 generations, and then hollowed out by 3 deaths in 3 years, arrived in one pair of hands. The hands belonged to a 19-year-old who had been in Spain for less than 3 years and had never seen Austria. Consider what was now attached to that one life: the Low Countries. Castile and Aragon, with everything their ships were reaching across the Atlantic, the Austrian lands, and the claim on the imperial title that came with them. 4 separate inheritances, 4 separate sets of local rights, and one man expected to be present in all of them. He spent his reign traveling. That is not a colorful detail. It is the direct operational consequence of holding territory that had no common institution to govern it in his absence. And it is why the inheritance would eventually be split between a son and a brother rather than passed whole. The title came last, and the title had to be bought. On the 28th of June, 1519, the electors meeting at Frankfurt chose him as Holy Roman Emperor. That office was elective rather than hereditary, which made it the one part of the whole accumulation that could not simply be inherited from a dead relative. It had to be won from 7 men who expected to be paid for their votes. They were paid in cash, with money borrowed against the revenues of the territories the family had acquired by marriage. Even the crown that could not be married into was bought with the proceeds of the ones that could. The money came from bankers in Augsburg, and it came against security that existed only because of what 2 weddings had delivered. Marriage had acquired the land raised the loan bought the title. Read that sequence backwards and it says something colder. The title was mortgaged before it was worn, and the security was other people's tax. Each stage was paid for by the stage before it, and the whole structure rested at the bottom on documents, marriage contracts, wills, treaties, oaths sworn to an infant by 3 sets of grown men, every one of them a piece of paper with names on it, and every one of them capable of being written, signed, contested, and undone by the same process that made it. So the count at the end of the first stretch of this story stands like this: 2 marriages spread across 2 generations, 4 grandparents, each of whom had held something worth having, 1 run of deaths that nobody arranged and nobody wanted, and what arrived at the far end was the largest inheritance in Europe. It rested on a man not yet 20. It had been assembled by a method that nobody using it had ever written down. The line in Latin came later. It described the result accurately, and it described the process not at all. Between 1516 and 1700, the kings of Spain contracted 11 marriages. 9 of them were to relatives. That is the number the rest of this story sits on. It is worth letting it sit there before anything is done with it. A figure like that can be made to mean far more than it does. 9 in 11 sounds like a decision. It was not one decision. It was 11 of them, taken across 5 reigns by people who never met each other. Each one had a name, a date, a negotiation behind it, and a dispensation to make it lawful. The pattern only exists when the 11 are laid side by side, and nobody alive during the first of them could lay them side by side. Inside those 9, 2 were between an uncle and his brother's or sister's daughter. 1 was between first cousins. The rest sat further out, at the distance of second cousins and beyond, where the relationship is real on a family tree and invisible in a room. Nobody at those weddings would have described the couple as close relations. On paper, all of them were. And the dispensations that made them lawful survive, filed and numbered, because the church that granted them kept accounts as carefully as the family did. The paperwork of this practice is not lost. It is one of the best documented things about the entire dynasty, which is precisely why it can now be counted. Consider what a dispensation actually was: a formal request, listing the exact relationship between the parties, submitted to Rome, assessed, priced, and granted in writing. In order to marry a relative, this family had to state on the record, every single time, exactly how closely they were related. 2 centuries of those statements survive. There is a particular irony in that, and it is worth stating once and then leaving alone. The mechanism that made these marriages lawful is the same mechanism that recorded, in precise legal language, exactly how close they were. The family did not hide the practice. It could not. Hiding it would have made the children illegitimate, and an illegitimate child inherits nothing, which would have defeated the entire purpose of the marriage in the first place. And here is the thing that gets left out whenever this family is discussed. Every ruling house in Europe did this. Marrying a cousin was the ordinary way to keep a claim inside a family, and the church sold dispensations to make it lawful, at a price that scaled with the closeness. The Bourbons did it. The Stuarts did it. The Portuguese royal house did it so persistently that its own line ran into similar trouble. The Spanish Habsburgs were not doing something nobody else did. They were doing the same thing more often, closer in, and for longer. That difference of degree turns out to be the entire difference. So the pattern is not exotic. It is ordinary practice, run at an unusual intensity, by a family that had more reason than most to keep its claims inside the house. What that looked like in a specific room, on a specific day, is the next thing worth establishing. Philip II married 4 times, and the sequence tells the story better than any summary. In 1543, he married Maria Manuela of Portugal, who was his double first cousin, related to him through both his mother and his father. She died in 1545, days after giving birth to a son called Carlos. Philip was 18 years old and already a widower with an heir. The second marriage was politics rather than descent. In 1554, he married Mary I of England, which made him joint sovereign of a country that did not want him and would not keep him. The marriage produced no children. Mary died in 1558. England went a different way within months, and the largest diplomatic marriage of the century left nothing behind it at all. It is worth noticing what that failure did not change. Philip's next choice was not to widen the field further. It was to narrow it, back toward the people he was already related to, because a marriage outside the family had just cost him 4 years and produced nothing. The third was French, and it was meant to end a war. Elizabeth of Valois married him in 1559 and gave him 2 daughters. In 1568, she miscarried and died the same day, and the newborn daughter died with her. Philip was 41. He had been married 3 times, had buried 3 wives, and had exactly 1 legitimate son. And then, in the same year, he lost the son as well. Carlos, the child of the first marriage, died under confinement in 1568, held on his father's orders. What was wrong with him, why he was confined, and what exactly killed him have been argued about ever since and cannot be settled here. The record is clear on the outcome and unreliable on everything else. What can be stated without dispute is the position it left. Within a few months of each other, the king had lost his wife, his newborn daughter, and his only legitimate son. 3 marriages had been arranged to secure a succession. At the end of the third, the succession was empty, and the man responsible for filling it was in his 40s, with a war in the Netherlands and an empire that stretched to the Pacific. Everything he governed was held on the same terms his great-grandfather's marriage had established. It belonged to a person, not to a state, and it would pass to whoever that person's body produced. That is the difference between this and a modern country. A modern state survives the death of anyone in it. This one could not, and everybody governing it knew that, which is why the health of one man's marriage was a matter of urgent concern to bankers in Genoa and admirals in the Atlantic. There was no other mechanism. There had never been another mechanism. A man in that position, in that century, does not grieve for long in public. He remarries. The question is only who is available and how quickly and how closely related she is. In May 1570, he married Anna of Austria. She was 21 and he was 43. She had been intended for Carlos before Carlos died, which meant she had spent part of her childhood being prepared for a Spain she would now enter on entirely different terms. The betrothal was redirected upward, from the son to the father. That solution occurred to more than one family in this story, and it will occur again inside a century. Anna was his niece, and she was his niece twice over. Her mother was Philip's own sister Maria. Her father was Maximilian II, who was Philip's first cousin. So the relationship ran through both of her parents at once. The couple standing at that altar were closer to one another than most brothers are to most sisters, in a family tree drawn without the loops. A dispensation was obtained for this. It was obtained routinely, at a price, from an institution that had granted the same family similar permissions for generations and had no reason to start refusing. The structural results are easier to state than to picture. Philip's sister became his mother-in-law. Philip became great-uncle to his own children. And the children of that marriage, when they came, drew their descent from a smaller pool of ancestors than either parent had. That is the only sentence in this section that will still matter in 200 years. At the time, it would have looked like the opposite of a problem. A niece from the imperial branch was the safest possible choice. She was Catholic without question. She was of unimpeachable rank. She brought no foreign faction into the household, and she was already family. Every consideration that governed the decision pointed the same way. Nothing in the available advice pointed anywhere else. Now move forward 79 years, past 2 more reigns, to a wedding outside Madrid in the autumn of 1649. The situation is different in every particular and identical in shape. Mariana of Austria had been engaged to Balthazar Charles, the heir to Spain. He died before the marriage could take place. What happened next is the same maneuver that had been performed in 1570, executed by different people for the same reason. The bride did not go home. The engagement moved up one generation. On the 7th of October, 1649, at Navalcarnero, outside Madrid, Philip IV married Mariana of Austria. She was his niece, the daughter of his sister. The dispensation was obtained, the ceremony was performed, and a woman who had been brought to Spain to marry the son married the father instead. He was 44, she was 14. Those are the ages. Nothing will be attached to them here. The record does not preserve what either of them thought, and inventing it would be the easiest and cheapest move available. What can be said is what followed, and what followed is the reason this marriage is in the story at all. Mariana would bear 5 children to this man. She would survive him by 31 years. She would govern Spain as regent for a son who could not govern it himself. And she would spend the last part of her life watching the succession she had been imported to secure fail in front of her, one child at a time, over 3 decades. Which brings this to a point where the story has to leave the 17th century for a while. Everything so far has come from marriage contracts, dispensations, and court records, all of it written by people who were present. The next thing was calculated in Spain in the year 2009, and it could not have been calculated before. A group of geneticists at the University of Santiago de Compostela built the family tree out to 16 generations. More than 3,000 individuals went into it. That is not a chart on a wall, it is a database, assembled from parish registers, court genealogies, and the family's own relentless record of itself. It exists because this particular family wrote everything down. A house that holds its property by descent has to prove descent. Proving descent means keeping registers. Keeping registers for 400 years means that somebody, eventually, can count what is in them. The registers were the family's title deed to everything, from Antwerp to Peru, and they were maintained with the seriousness that implies. What that pedigree produces is a single number for each king, called the inbreeding coefficient. It measures the probability that any 2 copies of a gene in one person came from the same ancestor. For Philip I, the founder of the Spanish line, it is 0.025. For Charles II, the last of them, it is 0.254. Across 5 generations, it multiplied roughly 10 times over. To give that final number a scale, a child of 2 full siblings would sit at about 0.25. So would the child of a parent and their own child. Charles II, whose parents were an uncle and a niece, arrives at essentially the same figure by a completely different route. No union anywhere in that pedigree was that close. The total was reached by accumulation rather than by any single act. That difference is the whole point, and it is the reason the family cannot simply be accused of doing something obviously reckless. What produced the final figure was a long series of decisions, each of which looked prudent in the room where it was taken, and that accumulation is the part worth slowing down for, because it is the part that answers the obvious question. Somebody in that family must have noticed. The answer is that the arithmetic was arranged so they could not. The study separates the coefficient into 2 sources. There is the part contributed by the recent close marriage, the uncle and the niece standing at the altar. And there is the part contributed by ancestral inbreeding, the accumulated effect of every distant cousin marriage further back. For most of these kings, the second part is substantial. A great deal of every total was already in place before the visible marriage was contracted. The bride and groom inherited it from ancestors neither of them had met, through lines neither of them was counting. A marriage between second cousins is unremarkable. It attracts no comment, needs a cheaper dispensation, and would strike nobody at court as a risk. Repeated across 5 generations, in a family that keeps returning to the same 3 or 4 houses because those are the only houses of equal rank. The distant matches add up to the same total as a close one would. The danger was distributed. Distributed danger is invisible. It has no moment. That is what makes it different from every other kind of dynastic mistake in this period. A lost battle has a date. A bad treaty has a signature. A ruinous loan has a ledger entry and a rate of interest. Every one of those can be identified, blamed on somebody, and argued about at the time. This had none of that. It was a slope, not an event, and nobody standing on a slope can feel it. There is no wedding at which somebody could have stood up and said that this one is the mistake, because no single one of them was the mistake. The mistake, if that is even the right word for it, was the shape of the whole set, and the whole set only existed as a shape after everyone involved was dead. So the honest position is this: nobody in the 16th or 17th century could have run that calculation, because the concept did not exist, the mathematics did not exist, and the pedigree had not yet been assembled into a form that would allow it. No contemporary source attempts it. That is not the same as saying they suspected nothing. Physicians and ambassadors wrote about the family's health at length, and the Venetian envoys in particular were merciless about it in their dispatches home. They noticed the jaw, they noticed the illnesses, they noticed how many children were buried. What they could not do was connect those 3 observations to each other, because the thing connecting them had no name and no theory behind it. They were describing symptoms of a cause that would not be articulated for another 300 years. It is only saying that what they suspected and what the number shows are 2 different kinds of knowledge, and only one of them can be checked. The last king is not an isolated case either. Several members of the dynasty carry computed coefficients above 0.20, which means the concentration was a property of the family and not a single unlucky outcome at the end of it. Charles II is the highest figure in the series. He is not a departure from the series. His grandfather sits high. His father sits high. His mother, who was also his cousin, sits high. He is the point where a curve that had been climbing for 5 generations reaches its maximum, and a curve reaching its maximum is not an accident. It is the last term of a sequence, and a sequence can be read in either direction. Read forward, it looks like a series of sensible marriages. Read backward from the last term, it looks like something being assembled, deliberately, by people who wanted this result. Neither reading is correct, because the family was not assembling anything. It was solving the same problem, the same way, over and over, and the solution had a cost that arrived on a delay of 5 generations. The published tables give a coefficient for every king of the line and for the women they married. So the rise can be followed marriage by marriage rather than inferred backward from the ending. It goes up, then up again, then holds for a generation, then goes up sharply at the end. Read across the line of consorts, it does the same thing. The women married into this family were, increasingly, already of it. That is what closes a pool. Not one dramatic decision, but the steady disappearance of anyone who is not already a relative from the list of people considered suitable. By the last generation, the list was very short indeed. The Spanish branch could marry into the Austrian branch, which was itself, or into France, which was the enemy, or into a German house of insufficient rank. Those were the options. When the field of acceptable partners has been reduced to 3, and one of them is a mirror, the outcome stops being a series of choices and starts being a mechanism. And a mechanism does not need anyone to intend its result. It only needs to keep running, which this one did, for 184 years, without a single person in it ever deciding that it should. It never once comes down. Coming down would have required marrying a stranger, and marrying a stranger was the one thing the method was designed to avoid. A stranger brings a foreign claim, a foreign faction, and a foreign confession. A cousin brings none of those. A cousin brings a dowry that stays inside the family accounts. She brings an alliance with a house already aligned. She brings a child whose descent from the founder runs through both parents rather than one. In the logic of a dynasty that owns its territories personally, that last point is not a defect. It reads as a strengthening of the claim. 2 lines of descent from the same founder are better than one, in exactly the way that 2 signatures on a contract are better than one. The family was not ignoring a risk. It was pursuing a benefit, and the benefit was real, and the cost was arriving on a timescale nobody was measuring. Every incentive the family could see pointed toward the choice that the number now shows was accumulating a cost. None of the incentives it could see pointed the other way. Consider the alternative from inside the room. To marry outside the family meant negotiating with a rival power and accepting a bride whose loyalty ran elsewhere. It meant importing her household, her confessor, and her brother's ambitions into the palace. It meant creating a claim on the inheritance for a foreign house. Every one of those was a visible, immediate, calculable risk. The other risk was invisible, delayed by generations, and had no name. That is the trap in its exact form. It was not a failure of intelligence or of care. It was a system in which the visible reasons and the invisible consequences ran in opposite directions for 200 years. There is one more thing to say before leaving the arithmetic, and it is the strangest part of the whole business. This family appears in the genetics literature as a standing example. Researchers use the Habsburg pedigree the way a laboratory uses a controlled population, because it offers something almost no other human lineage does: a large number of individuals, a narrow and repeatedly intermarried ancestry, and a written record complete enough to trace every line for centuries without a gap. Ordinary populations do not offer that. Records go missing, families move, names repeat, and generations blur. The people who lived inside this pedigree were among the most heavily documented human beings of their era, and the documentation was produced for the exclusive benefit of the family itself. Nobody was keeping those registers for posterity. They were kept to prove a claim, settle an inheritance, and satisfy a canon lawyer. Their survival into a modern statistical study is entirely incidental to the reason they exist. Nobody involved would have understood what the study was for. Everybody involved would have understood the registers perfectly, because to them, the registers were the estate. Burn the registers, and the claim to Milan becomes an assertion. Keep them, and the claim is a fact that can be produced in a court, in front of a lawyer, in ink that is older than the dispute, which means the measurement depends on the thing being measured. The family kept those registers because descent was the whole basis of its claim to everything it held. Every birth, every marriage, every dispensation was recorded precisely because the paperwork was the property. And that same paperwork, 4 centuries later, is what allows the cost of the practice to be calculated to 3 decimal places by people the family never imagined. One comparison closes this. The Austrian branch of the same family, descended from the same ancestors and using the same method, does not reach the same figures. It married close, but not as close, and not as consistently, and it had a wider field of available partners in Central Europe. The difference is not one of principle. It is one of intensity, and of how few doors the Spanish branch had left open by the end. Vienna could look east and north for partners. Madrid, holding the larger empire and the higher rank, had fewer houses it considered its equal, and it was at war with the nearest of them for most of 2 centuries. France was the obvious alternative, and France was the enemy, so every generation the obvious alternative was ruled out again, for reasons that had nothing to do with descent and everything to do with the last campaign. The gap between the 2 branches is going to matter a great deal later. One of them ends inside this story. The other one does not, and the difference between them is not virtue, or luck, or better medicine. It is arithmetic, accumulated marriage by marriage across 2 centuries, by people making reasonable decisions one at a time. Which is the harder story to tell, and the more accurate one? There is no villain in it. There is a system, and a set of incentives, and a cost that fell entirely on people who had no part in any of the decisions that produced it. So the pattern that the first half of this story described as a method now has a measurement attached to it. 9 marriages in 11, 2 of them uncle to niece, contracted 79 years apart by men who had each just buried the person the marriage was originally meant for. A coefficient that multiplies 10 times across 5 generations and never falls. And underneath the visible weddings, a much larger accumulation contributed by distant relatives whose names nobody at court would have thought to connect. The family could see the marriages it was making. It could not see the sum. Here is what the pattern cost, stated as plainly as the evidence allows. Of the children born into the Spanish Habsburg line across the period studied, roughly half did not live to see their first birthday. Not half of the ones who fell ill. Half of all of them, counted from the cradle. That is not a figure anyone in the 17th century compiled. It comes from counting the births and the burials afterwards. That is a thing which can only be done once everybody involved is long past being upset by it. To know whether that means anything, it has to be set against something. In the Spanish villages of the same period, roughly 8 children in 10 survived their first year. Those villages had bad water, no physicians worth the name, harvest failures, and a diet that would horrify anyone. They buried 2 children in 10. The palace buried 5. Hold those 2 numbers next to each other for a moment, because everything anyone thinks they know about the advantages of wealth in the early modern period is sitting in the gap between them. Turn that comparison over, and the strangeness of it becomes clear. The dynasty had the warmest rooms in Europe. It had the first call on grain in a famine year, physicians attending daily, clean linen, wet nurses selected and paid for, and no need for any mother in it to work through a pregnancy. Every material advantage that existed in that century, this family had. It lost its infants at more than twice the rate of the laborers who grew its food. The comparison has to carry its own warning. Palace deaths and village deaths were not recorded by the same people, to the same standard, or with the same completeness. A stillbirth in a parish register and one in a court chronicle are not necessarily counted the same way. The village figure is an estimate drawn from surviving registers rather than a census. So the exact ratio is indicative and not precise. What survives that warning is the direction. Whatever the precise numbers, the gap runs the wrong way. And it runs the wrong way by a wide margin, against every advantage that money and power could buy in the 17th century. That is the finding. Not a figure to 2 decimal places, but a direction that no amount of recording error is going to reverse. To make that gap disappear, the village registers would have to be wrong by a margin nobody has ever suggested they are wrong by, and wrong in one direction only. So the effect is real, and the size of it is the harder question. The study that produced the coefficients also tried to put a number on the damage, and the way it reports that number is worth attending to carefully. At the level of first cousins, which is a coefficient of 0.0625, the estimated reduction in survival to the age of 10 is 17.8%. That is the headline figure, and it is the one that gets quoted. Consider what it measures, not deaths in infancy alone, but survival all the way to the age of 10. That captures the children who lived long enough to be given a name, a household, and a place at table before they were lost. The figure does not travel alone. The stated uncertainty on it is plus or minus 12.3 percentage points. So the true effect could be as low as 5.5% or as high as 30%. That is an enormous band. Quoting 17.8 without it would be a small lie of the kind that is very easy to tell and very hard to notice. What an estimate shaped like that actually establishes is worth being exact about. It establishes the direction with confidence. Close marriage reduced the chance that a child in this family reached 10, and the study is clear that it did. It does not establish the size. A range from 5.5% to 30% covers the difference between a modest effect and a catastrophic one, and the honest position is that the evidence cannot separate them. Anyone telling this story with a precise death toll attached has gone past what the evidence carries. The evidence is interesting enough without the extra, which is where the numbers have to stop and the names have to start. A rate is a description of a population. What follows happened to particular children, in particular years, in rooms that can still be visited. They had names, and household accounts recorded what was spent on them, and painters were paid to make their likenesses while they were alive. Philip IV married Elizabeth of France. and between them they had 10 children. One son survived infancy. The daughters fared somewhat better, and the sons did not. And by the middle of the 1640s, the entire male succession of the Spanish Empire rested on a single adolescent boy named Balthazar Charles. He died on the 9th of October, 1646, of smallpox at the age of 16. Smallpox is the recorded cause, and it is a sufficient one. It killed heirs across Europe in that century, and it required no help from anybody's ancestry to do it. This is one death in this story that the arithmetic does not explain, and it should not be made to. Smallpox took heirs from families with no consanguinity at all. It took them from families that had never married a cousin in their lives. The Portuguese, the French, and the English all lost heirs to it in the same century. What separates this family is not that it lost a boy to smallpox. It is that when it lost him, the replacement had to be produced by a marriage even closer than the one that had produced him. The response to a broken succession was to tighten the very thing that was breaking it. Not because anybody understood that, but because tightening was the only move the system had. The temptation, once a pattern has been established, is to hand it every death in reach. That temptation has to be refused here, and refusing it is what makes the deaths it does explain worth stating. A claim that survives its own limits is worth more than a claim that has been stretched to cover everything. And what survives here is substantial enough. A family that buried half its infants while the villagers around it buried 2 in 10. A survival penalty whose direction is certain. A facial pattern that tracks descent across 6 generations. None of that needed exaggerating, and all of it was recorded by the family itself. The legend says the Habsburgs destroyed themselves by inbreeding. The evidence says something narrower and stranger. They ran a system that worked for 200 years, and the system was quietly billing them the entire time. The bill was presented in a nursery, 1 child at a time, across 5 generations, and nobody in the building could read it. What it left behind is the thing that matters. Philip IV was 41 years old, ruler of an empire that reached from Naples to Manila, and he had no legitimate son. Everything he held was personal property that would pass to his body's issue, and his body had produced 1 surviving son in 10 attempts, and that son was now dead. He also had a niece in Vienna who had been engaged to the boy who had just died. What happened next had happened before, 79 years earlier, to his great-grandfather. The bride intended for the dead son was redirected to the father. The same maneuver, in the same family, for the same reason, executed by people who almost certainly knew the precedent, because the precedent was their own great-grandfather. So the marriage was made, and the second family began, and this is where the record stops being about policy and becomes very difficult to read. Mariana of Austria bore 5 children to her uncle. 2 of them reached adulthood, the other 3 did not. They are recorded in the household accounts the way everything else in that palace was recorded, by name, with dates, in the same hand that recorded the candles and the linen. Margarita Maria, who lived 2 weeks, a daughter who was born and died on the same day in 1656, a son who did not last the year. Each of them had a wet nurse engaged, a cradle prepared, and a set of announcements drafted for the courts of Europe. Each of them had those announcements cancelled. There is a particular administrative shape to grief in a court like this one. It leaves a paper trail of preparations that were not needed, and the preparations survive better than any record of what anyone felt about them. Margarita Teresa, born in 1651, was the first survivor. She reached adulthood and married her mother's brother in Vienna, which was another uncle and niece match, inside the same generation. She died in 1673, at the age of 21. 4 of her own children were born. 1 outlived her. So, the pattern that had already taken 3 of her siblings followed her to Vienna and worked on her children there. A different palace, a different court, the same rate. She had married her mother's brother, which meant her children carried the concentration from both sides again, and the arithmetic did not care which capital it was operating in. Philip Prospero was born on the 28th of November, 1657, and was the heir for 4 years. He suffered from seizures through his short life, and the court knew, and the ambassadors reported it home in coded dispatches to governments that were already calculating. He died on the 1st of November, 1661, after a severe one, 3 weeks short of his 4th birthday, and Spain lost a second crown prince inside 15 years, 2 heirs, 2 funerals, and a king in his 50s whose wife was still in her 20s. The whole apparatus of the monarchy now depended on whether one more child could be produced, and whether that child could survive the thing that had taken the others. There is a painting of that child. Velázquez made it in the last years of the boy's life, and it hangs in Vienna now. He is standing in a red dress with a small white dog beside him, and there are amulets pinned to his clothing, hung there to protect him. They are painted with the same care as the lace. Somebody in that household believed those amulets might work, or at least believed it was worth the risk of them not working, and somebody instructed the greatest painter in Europe to include them in the official likeness of the heir to the Spanish Empire, which means their presence was not a private superstition, it was policy, and it tells you what the household actually believed about the odds. Amulets are not commissioned for a healthy heir. They are commissioned when the people responsible have run out of things that work and have started on things that might. That child had physicians, the best available in Europe, attending him daily. He also had charms pinned to his coat. Both facts are in the same painting, and the painting was approved. The heir to the largest empire on earth was being protected by charms, and the court was content for foreign ambassadors to see it. A court that could commission that portrait could not keep the sitter alive for another 2 years. Her brother had a portrait, and she had a masterpiece. Margarita Teresa is the child at the center of Las Meninas. It was painted while the succession still depended on children who were dying, in a room of the palace where the question was being lived out daily. The picture is famous for its composition and its mirrors and its problems of perspective. It is also a photograph of a dynastic emergency, taken by somebody who worked in the building. The girl at the center of it was, at that moment, the only surviving child of the king. Everyone in that room knew it. The painting has been discussed for 3.5 centuries in terms of what Velázquez was doing with mirrors. It can also be read as a document about a succession that had already failed twice and would fail again. 2 crown princes were dead by the time it was hung. The girl in the middle of it would be sent to Vienna, bear 4 children, and be buried at 21. And a court portrait is not a neutral document. Every one of these was commissioned, approved, and paid for. The painter worked to instruction, in a house where displeasing the sitter's family was a serious matter, and the results were sent abroad to demonstrate that the dynasty was healthy and its children were thriving. That is the purpose these images served while their subjects were alive. A portrait went out with a marriage proposal. It was studied by foreign courts for evidence of health, and it was expected to provide reassurance. Reading these paintings as clinical records reverses the whole reason they exist. They are advertisements. They were commissioned to sell a marriage, reassure an ally, or intimidate a rival, and every one of them was approved before it left the workshop. That approval is the point. Somebody looked at each of these paintings, considered whether it served the interests of the house, and let it go out. The jaw survived that process every time. The one who lived was painted too. Carreno de Miranda's portraits of Charles II as a young king hang in the same collections as the pictures of the siblings who did not reach adulthood. They were made by the same institution, for the same reason, under the same instructions. Looking at them together is the closest thing available to seeing what this cost, and it is still only paint. Nobody was photographing anything. Nobody was measuring anything. What survives is a series of images made to be flattering, of people who mostly did not live very long, produced by an institution with an interest in how they appeared. And yet the jaw is in them. Whatever the painters were instructed to soften, that feature comes through in portrait after portrait, across 6 generations and several workshops, which is itself a small piece of evidence about how pronounced it must have been. Which brings this to the man the whole story has been traveling toward. And the first thing to establish about him is not what he was like, it is who was doing the describing. Almost everything written about Charles II in his lifetime was written by ambassadors and courtiers. Ambassadors were reporting to governments that needed to know how long he would live, because the disposal of an empire depended on the answer. Courtiers were positioning themselves in a succession struggle that ran the entire length of his reign. Nobody describing this man had a neutral interest in the description. The French ambassador wanted him dead, and the succession settled. The Austrian ambassador wanted him alive, long enough for Vienna to prepare. Every dispatch about his health was written to move a policy in a capital city hundreds of miles away. Which is why the descriptions have to be read as a class of evidence rather than as observation. They agree with each other, and their agreement is worth something. But they agree the way a market agrees on a price, not the way witnesses agree on a fact. Every capital in Europe was pricing the same asset, which was the remaining lifespan of one man, and all of them were reading the same limited set of signals to do it. With that stated, the record is consistent enough to be taken seriously. It describes a man who was physically and mentally disabled, whose speech was difficult to follow, and whose health was poor throughout a reign of 35 years. The descriptions come from hostile sources and friendly ones, from people trying to talk up his prospects and people trying to talk them down, and they broadly agree. By the age of 35, he had lost his hair. He suffered seizures, as his elder brother had. The reports of his last years describe a man who could barely walk without assistance, and who was carried to state occasions so that he could be seen to be present. Being seen was most of what the office required by then. The government of the empire had passed to councils, favorites, and his mother, and the king's function had narrowed to existing, in public, at intervals. He was 38 when he died, and the ambassadors had been predicting his death for most of 3 decades. He became king at 3 years old, in 1665, when his father died. His mother governed as regent, so a child who could not yet speak became the personal owner of Castile, Aragon, Naples, Sicily, Milan, and the Netherlands, along with everything Spain held across the Atlantic and the Pacific. The machinery of that empire arranged itself around a nursery. His mother held that regency for a decade, lost it to a faction gathered around his illegitimate half-brother, and took it back when that half-brother died in 1679. 31 years after arriving in Spain as a bride of 14, she was still the person the empire actually turned on. The girl of 14 who had been married to her uncle because his son died had become the effective government of the largest empire in the world, and she held that position because her son could not. He was fed by wet nurses until he was 5 or 6 years old, which was extraordinary even by the standards of a royal household. The wet nurses were selected, examined, housed, and paid. The arrangement continued years past the point where any other child would have been weaned. He was not developing as other children did, and nobody was willing to be the person who forced the issue. He did not speak until he was about 8. His jaw and his tongue made speech difficult for the whole of his life. People meeting him for the first time often could not follow him, and had his words repeated by an attendant who was used to them. The condition was physical. It was visible in every portrait, and it had been visible in his ancestors' portraits for 6 generations. It was not new. It was the same feature, in the same family, arriving at its most pronounced form in the last person to carry the name. Anyone who had looked at the family's own portrait galleries could have seen the progression. The pictures were hanging on the walls of the palace, in order, generation by generation. What nobody could do was explain it, because explaining it required a science that did not exist. The observation was available for 2 centuries. The explanation arrived 300 years after the last person it applied to was buried, which is the shape of this entire story in one sentence. Everything needed to see the pattern was recorded at the time in enormous detail by the people it was happening to. The thing that was missing was not information. It was the idea that would have made the information mean something. They had the registers, they had the portraits, they had the burials, the physician's notes, and the ambassador's dispatches. What they did not have was any way to add those 4 things together. He was not permitted to walk unaided until he was nearly grown, and when he did walk, his legs would not reliably hold him, and he fell. What none of this establishes is anything at all about his mind. A man who cannot be understood is very easily assumed to have nothing to say. And the people making that assumption about this man were, without exception, people who benefited from his incapacity being taken for granted. The jaw is the part everybody knows. It has a name, it is a joke in 100 places, and it is the one piece of this story that most people have already met so it is worth finding out what can actually be shown about it, because the answer is narrower than the reputation. In 2019, a group of researchers took 66 portraits of 15 members of the family and gave them to 10 maxillofacial surgeons. The surgeons scored 18 separate features in each face, working from the paintings. Those scores were then set against inbreeding coefficients, calculated from a pedigree of more than 6,000 people. The result is the number that matters, and it is not the number people expect. Differences in inbreeding accounted for about 22% of the variation in the severity of the jaw. Roughly 1/5, not most of it, not the cause of it. About 1/5 of the differences between one Habsburg face and another can be attributed to how closely their parents were related. The other 4/5 are ordinary human variation, painterly convention, the age of the sitter, and everything else that makes one face differ from another. The jaw is real, the link is real, and the link is 1/5 of the story, rather than the whole of it. The relationship is real, it is statistically solid, and it leaves about 4/5 of the variation explained by something else entirely. The study found something more useful than the headline. The protruding lower jaw and the underdeveloped upper face moved together in the same individuals, which is what a broadly recessive inheritance pattern looks like. That is a finding about mechanism rather than about blame, and it is the kind of finding a painted face can genuinely support. Two features appearing together, repeatedly, in people who share ancestry is a pattern strong enough to survive the weaknesses of the evidence. A precise diagnosis of any individual sitter would not be. This is the difference between saying that a family carried something and saying that a particular man suffered from a particular condition. The first is supportable, the second requires remains, and the remains have not been examined. They lie in the escorial, in the same vault as the rest of the line, and no study has opened them. Everything in the modern literature is therefore built from paper and paint, which is a great deal more than most families leave and considerably less than a laboratory would want. The authors say plainly what their evidence cannot do. Portraits flatter. Painters have styles. And a workshop that has painted one Habsburg jaw will paint the next one partly from expectation. Court portraiture had conventions about how a face was shown, and none of those conventions were designed to preserve a clinical record for anybody 4 centuries later. So the single explanation everybody arrives with does not survive contact with the evidence. Close marriage, reduced survival, and the direction is certain and the size is loose. It is associated with the jaw, and it explains about 1/5 of it. It cannot account for smallpox at 16, and it cannot be measured in a portrait without carrying the limits of a portrait. What is left is smaller than the legend and much harder to dismiss. Every part of it is bounded, stated with its error, and still pointing the same way. Charles II married twice, and the 2 marriages together lasted 21 years and produced nothing. Marie-Louise of Orleans arrived from France in 1679. She was 19. She died on the 12th of February, 1689, aged 26, after 10 years in a court that watched her body the way a creditor watches a ledger. Every month, without a pregnancy, was reported to Paris and to Vienna. Her physicians were questioned by ambassadors. A woman in that position had no private life at all. Her private life was the succession of an empire. Everybody with an interest in that empire treated it as their business. The second wife was selected within months, and the criterion applied to the selection is recorded. Mariana of Neuburg came from a family famous for producing large numbers of surviving children. That was the argument for her. A dynasty that had run out of every other idea reached for fertility as a heritable quality and married it. That is the same reasoning which had governed every choice in this story, applied one final time. 11 more years produced nothing either. Which of them could not conceive is not established by any source, and the question was argued furiously at the time by people with reasons to blame one side or the other. The French party blamed the Queen. The Austrian party blamed the other queen. Nobody involved had any means of finding out, and nobody since has had remains to examine. So the record preserves 21 years of blame and no evidence, which is a fair summary of how this question was handled at the time. So the court did what courts in that century did, when medicine had been exhausted and the stakes were an empire. It looked for a cause outside the body. In January 1698, the King of Spain asked the Inquisitor General to investigate whether he had been bewitched. That request came from him. It was not imposed on him by his confessor, his mother, or a faction. It is recorded as his own instruction, which makes it one of the very few decisions in that reign that is unambiguously his. Exorcisms followed. The proceedings ran through the year, and in September they returned an answer. The king had been bewitched twice, they reported, once to make him ill and once to make him unable to father a child. 2 separate curses, cast years apart. That is a strikingly precise conclusion to reach about a question nobody could investigate. It also happens to divide the problem exactly the way the court understood it. The king was ill, and the king was childless, and these were treated as 2 separate afflictions, requiring 2 separate explanations. That is where the name comes from. El Hechizado, the bewitched. It is the label he carries in Spanish histories to this day. It was applied to him by other people, in his own lifetime, on the strength of proceedings he had commissioned himself. He asked a question, and was given a nickname. There is something worth noticing in the sequence. A man who had spent his life being described by other people commissioned an investigation into his own condition. The result of it became the name he has carried ever since. And the investigation itself was, in its way, a reasonable act. Every physician in Spain had failed. The succession of an empire depended on the answer. When the available medicine has been exhausted, a man in that position looks wherever there is left to look. When he died, the body was opened, and the physician wrote a description that has been quoted ever since. It recorded a body containing not a single drop of blood, a heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, gangrenous intestines, and a head full of water. It is the most vivid passage in the entire literature about this family, and it is quoted constantly, usually without any indication of what it is. It is also not anatomy. A heart the size of a peppercorn is not a thing a human body can contain and remain alive until the morning of that day. A body with no blood in it at all is not a finding. It is a statement. What that document records is how the death was reported. It was written by a man working in a tradition where an extraordinary king required an extraordinary corpse. It is testimony about the reporting rather than about the body. The modern proposal is more careful and much quieter. The researchers who calculated the coefficients suggest two separate recessive disorders occurring together: a combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis. Between them, those two could account for the growth failure, the weakness, the infertility, and the digestive problems the record describes. And they call it speculation. That word is theirs, printed in their own paper, and it has to travel with the proposal wherever the proposal goes. Nothing has been tested. The remains have not been examined. What exists is a plausible reconstruction offered by careful people who marked it clearly as a reconstruction, and the honest thing to do with it is to repeat both halves. The proposal is worth having. It fits the recorded symptoms better than anything else on offer, and it comes from the same team that produced the coefficients. It is also unconfirmed, and it will stay unconfirmed until somebody opens a tomb. Until then, the most that can honestly be said is this: a man's recorded symptoms are consistent with two inherited conditions. His parents were an uncle and his niece. Those two statements sit next to each other, and no proven line has been drawn between them. That is less satisfying than the legend, and it is what the evidence supports. The legend wants a curse or a diagnosis. The record offers a coefficient of 0.254, a list of symptoms, and a very careful sentence from 4 geneticists who marked their own conclusion as unproven. Anyone who wants a cleaner ending than that is going to have to invent it. And inventing it would be easy. The materials are all here: a bewitched king, a monstrous autopsy, a family that married its own nieces for 200 years and produced a man who could not walk or speak clearly. Every one of those is true, and every one of them is bounded, and the bounded version is the one that holds up. While all of this was going on inside the palace, something else was happening outside it. The disposal of the empire had already begun, and the man who owned it was still alive. In October 1698, France and England signed a treaty dividing the Spanish inheritance between them. Spain was not a party to it. The largest share was assigned to Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. He was 6 years old, and his advantage was that he was related to everybody and threatening to nobody. He was also a great-grandson of Philip IV, which is how he had a claim at all. He died of smallpox on the 6th of February, 1699, 4 months later. A treaty between two great powers, dividing 3 continents, was voided by the death of a child who never knew what had been arranged for him. Smallpox had taken Balthazar Charles 53 years earlier. It now took the compromise as well. The same disease that had removed one heir in 1646 removed the diplomatic solution to the crisis that heir's death had created. That is not irony. It is simply what smallpox did to European politics in that century, repeatedly, to everybody. What is worth noticing is the position it left. With the compromise candidate dead, the only remaining options were a French prince or an Austrian one, which meant the choice could no longer be made without making an enemy of a great power. A second treaty followed in 1700, assigning the greater part to the Archduke Charles of Austria, with Naples, Sicily, and Milan going to France as compensation. Again, Spain was not consulted. Two foreign governments had now twice divided a living man's property between them, in writing, while he was in the building. Copies reached Madrid. The court knew what had been agreed, and knew that neither treaty carried a single Spanish signature. 223 years after a marriage had assembled this inheritance without a war, foreign powers were taking it apart the same way, with documents. And the family that had perfected the method was on the receiving end of it, and the living man knew. Whatever else was wrong with him, he was not ignorant of what was being done. In the last month of his life, he did the one thing still available to a man whose authority had been reduced to the disposal of an estate. On the 3rd of October, 1700, he signed his will. It named Philip of Anjou, the second grandson of Louis XIV, as his sole heir. Of every possible outcome, this was the one the partition treaties had been designed to prevent, and it was chosen by the only person with the legal standing to choose it. The crucial word in the document is undivided. Everything was to pass together, entire, in one piece, to one person. Whatever had been negotiated in London and Versailles about splitting it, the will refused the split, and it refused in the only language the courts of Europe treated as binding, which was the language of a testament. Cardinal Portocarrero pressed the French case hard in the last months, and he is usually given the credit or the blame for the outcome. Whether he changed a mind or confirmed one is not recoverable. The argument he had available was simple and did not require anybody to love France. Only France was strong enough to hold the empire together against everybody else. The alternative on the table was the empire cut into pieces by foreigners who had already drawn the lines twice. He died on the 1st of November, 1700, 29 days after signing. He was 38 years old. He had been king since he was 3, which is 35 years of reign, most of it conducted by other people in his name, and with him, the Spanish Habsburg male line ended, not diminished, not weakened, ended on a specific afternoon, in a specific room, with no male successor of the name anywhere in existence. 184 years had passed since Charles arrived in Spain as a 19-year-old who could not speak the language. In that time, the family had governed the largest empire the world had seen. It financed that empire, bankrupted it repeatedly, and defended it across 2 oceans. At the end of the whole exercise, it produced one man who could not produce a child. The will was signed to prevent a war. It started one within a year, which is what usually happens when a document that valuable is signed in favor of the strongest party present. England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria declared war on France and Spain in 1702, backing the Archduke Charles. What they objected to was not the person of Philip of Anjou. It was the prospect of France and Spain, the 2 largest powers in Europe, governed by one family with a common interest. That would have made every other state on the continent a client. Between the 1st and the 4th of August 1704, an Anglo-Dutch force took Gibraltar. 4 days. A rock at the mouth of the Mediterranean that Spain had held for 2.5 centuries changed hands in less than a week, and it has never been returned. 3 centuries later, it is still British, still an argument, and it entered British hands as a side effect of one Spanish king being unable to father a child. 9 days later, at Blenheim on the Danube, the Allied army under Marlborough and Eugene of Savoy broke the Franco-Bavarian army. Reported casualties on the losing side run to about 35,000 men, against roughly 12,000 Allied. In a single afternoon, more men were killed or taken than the Spanish Habsburg Dynasty had contained living members in its entire history. The war ran for 12 more years after that. Estimates of the total dead across all theaters run to several 100,000. It was fought, in the end, over which of 2 foreign princes would inherit an estate from a man who had died childless. Nobody who died at Blenheim had any stake in the question. They died over the contents of a will, a document signed by a dying man in Madrid at the urging of his council in October 1700. 3 weeks later he was dead, and the document was the only thing of his that still had any force. That is not a rhetorical flourish, it is the legal position. The claim being contested was a testamentary one. The arguments on both sides were arguments about inheritance law and descent. The lawyers drafting them worked from the same family registers described earlier. Philip won Spain in the end, and what he did with it is the part that gets left out of the story. Between 1707 and 1716, he issued a series of decrees abolishing the separate charters of Aragon, Valencia, Majorca, and Catalonia. Valencia and Aragon lost theirs in 1707, Majorca in 1715, Catalonia in 1716. Those charters were the thing that had made the inheritance an assembly rather than a country. They were the direct descendants of the privileges that towns had waived at Maximilian 230 years earlier. The new king abolished them and folded everything into Castile. For the first time in its history, Spain became a single centralized state. It took the extinction of the family that had assembled it and a war that killed several 100,000 people to turn the collection into a country. Catalonia held out until 1714. Barcelona fell in September of that year after a siege, and the charter that had survived every Habsburg king was abolished by the first Bourbon one within 18 months. Those privileges had outlasted Charles V, Philip II, and every ruler who had found them inconvenient for 2 centuries. The family that could not govern them had at least left them standing. The family that replaced it did not. There is a hard irony in that, and it is worth stating once. The dynasty that held its territories by nothing but documents had always respected other people's documents, because its own claim depended on the principle. The king who arrived by will, not by descent, had no such need. The settlement signed at Utrecht and Rastatt between 1713 and 1715 confirmed Philip as King of Spain, on one condition: the crowns of France and Spain were never to be united in one person. The precise thing the marriage strategy had spent 2 centuries achieving. The joining of inheritances in a single pair of hands was now explicitly forbidden by treaty. Europe had watched one family accumulate everything by marrying carefully. The settlement that ended the resulting war was written specifically to stop it happening again. That clause is the method's obituary. and it was drafted by the people who had spent a century fighting it. One clause of that settlement moved something else: the contract to supply enslaved people to Spanish America, the Asiento, passed to Britain. The terms were specific: 4,800 people every year, for 30 years. That is 144,000 human beings, written into a peace treaty as an annual quantity. It sits in the same document, in the same register of language, as the transfer of a fortress and the recognition of a king. It is worth stopping on that for one sentence. The whole of this story has been about what a family paid for its method. This is the part of the bill that was not paid by the family. The dynasty's failure to produce an heir ended in a war. The war ended in a settlement. The settlement contained a clause putting a number on how many people would be carried across the Atlantic each year and sold. They were not Habsburgs. They had nothing to do with any of it. They were not born when the marriages were contracted. They lived on a different continent, and their names are not in any of the registers this story has relied on. The dynasty kept extraordinary records of its own descent. It kept none of theirs. The registers that make this story possible are the reason one set of names survives and the other does not. And that is a fact about the archive rather than about the people in it. That asymmetry is worth one more sentence. This entire account has been possible because a family wrote down every birth, marriage, and death for 200 years in order to protect its property. The people in the Asiento clause appear in the record only as a quantity. Nobody with an interest in them was keeping registers, and the number 4,800 is the entirety of what the treaty preserves about them. One family's descent occupies 6,000 entries in a modern pedigree. 144,000 people occupy a single line in a treaty, expressed as a rate. One more thing has to be said, because the ending is usually told wrong. The Habsburgs did not end in 1700. The Austrian branch continued without interruption, held the imperial title for most of the next 2 centuries, and did not finish until 1918. What ended was the Spanish male line. That difference sounds like pedantry, and it is the opposite. The family survived. The method survived. What failed was one branch that had run the method hardest, in the place where it had the fewest partners available, for the longest time. The Austrian line went on to lose an empire too, eventually, but it lost it to armies, and to nationalism, and to a world war, which is the ordinary way empires end. The Spanish line ended in a bedroom, or rather it ended in a series of them, across 5 generations, and the last one was simply where the sequence ran out. And the branch that survived is the branch that married slightly wider. Its coefficients run lower. It married close, repeatedly, and it did not close its options as completely, because Central Europe offered it more houses of acceptable rank than Madrid could find. The difference between the branch that ended and the branch that did not is not a difference of character. It is a difference in how many doors were left open. Vienna could marry into Bavaria, Saxony, Poland, Portugal, and a dozen smaller houses. Madrid, with the higher rank and the larger empire, had convinced itself that almost none of those were good enough, and had been at war with the one that was. So the pool that had begun in 1477 with the whole of Europe available to it, had narrowed, by 1649, to a single household in Vienna. That is what closing a field looks like, when it is done slowly, by sensible people, for good reasons, across 5 generations. Nobody shuts the last door. The doors are simply not opened, one at a time, until there is only one left, and it leads back into the same house. And by the last generation, the house had one occupant left, and he could not father a child. Every other route had been closed by people who were, each time, making the safer choice. That is the part that should be uncomfortable. Nobody in this story behaved recklessly. Each generation looked at the field available to it, chose the partner who brought the least risk and the strongest claim, and passed the accumulated consequence forward to people not yet born. There is no point in the 200 years at which somebody could have been arrested for it. There is no decision that can be pulled out and labeled the fatal one. There is only a slope, and a family walking down it politely, holding the correct documents, which returns this to the thing it started with. Throughout the entire 223 years, the empire was never a country in law. It was an estate. It could be inherited, willed, and divided by treaty between foreign powers. It could be mortgaged against a loan. It could be disposed of in a document signed by one man 29 days before he died. That is what it was in 1477, and that is what it still was in 1700. So the instrument at the beginning and the instrument at the end are the same object. A marriage contract signed in August 1477 moved 4 provinces along the North Sea. A will signed in October 1700 moved Castile, Aragon, Naples, Sicily, Milan, the Netherlands, and the Americas. Both were documents with names on them. Both were binding, because everybody agreed to treat them as binding. Neither required an army until somebody disagreed. And on both occasions somebody did disagree, and on both occasions the disagreement was settled by force, and the document survived the fighting to be read afterwards as the thing that had actually decided the matter. A family that made itself out of paper was ended by a body. That is the whole of it. The method worked brilliantly for 2 centuries, and it worked by keeping the claims inside the house. And keeping the claims inside the house meant keeping the marriages inside the house. Every generation the field narrowed. Every generation the paperwork got stronger and the pool got smaller. And at the end, there was a man with the most comprehensively documented claim to the largest empire on earth, and no way to pass it to anybody. The one thing a document cannot do is produce a child. He signed it over to a stranger and died. The record of his family survived him so completely that 3 centuries later it could be used to calculate what the arrangement had cost.